Hi, Radhika.
Hi, Janki. How are you?
I'm well. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation.
Oh, it's my pleasure entirely. I've been wanting to speak to you for such a long time, and this is such a good opportunity, or shall I say, excuse to talk to you.
I'm really excited to be in conversation and to catch up.
Okay, let me start by introducing you. Radhika Govindarajan is a cultural anthropologist who studies how humans relate to animals in rural Uttarakhand. We tend to think of humans and animals as two separate entities. In her book, Animal Intimacies, published in 2018, Radhika blurs these boundaries. Animals are imbued with symbolism, they're worshipped, but there's also violence and affection at the heart of people's interactions with these animals. To add even more complex layers, Radhika channels aspects such as colonial history, nationalism, and gender politics, which don't usually come to mind when we think of animals. So, Radhika, let me start by asking you, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I wanted to be a veterinarian. I that was my big fantasy. I grew up reading a lot of Gerald Durrell and James Herriot, and I thought that there was no better thing in the world. Except when I was in school, I realized that would entail going into the sciences, which very quickly I realized was not my forte. So that connection to animals, I think, got parlayed into my anthropological work.
So, is that what you would have become if you hadn't become an anthropologist?
In another life, yeah, I think I would still be some kind of writer if I wasn't an anthropologist. I really enjoy writing, but I think writing about animals and thinking with them and working with them is something I've always enjoyed.
Who are your heroes in real life?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's hard for me to answer. My heroes keep shifting. I think I'm always really inspired by people who try and speak against power, even when they have a lot to lose. And I think there are lots of heroes in that vein, but I really am always inspired by people who have the courage to try and change the world and shift the nature of the world that we're in towards more ethical and towards more ethical ends. So those are my heroes, I think.
Is there a specific person you're thinking of?
Um, I can't think of a specific person, but I'm in this moment right now where there are Black Lives Matter protests happening in the US. Those are connecting to struggles, Dalit struggles in India, Kashmiri struggles for freedom. I think those kinds of movements really inspire me.
Okay, so what's a cultural anthropologist?
That's a great question. And I will try to make sure that I keep my answer restrained because this is something I could go on for a while. Cultural anthropologists are often thought of as people who study culture. And I find that a problematic understanding for multiple reasons, because I think the very category culture is one that emerges from the colonial history of the discipline. And culture is something that in early anthropology was understood as somewhat static and timeless. It was always a thing that existed outside the West. So the West was seen as a zone of science and the rest had culture. And so that understanding of culture saw it as something static. It didn't really allow us to think about questions of power. So whose culture counts as the dominant culture, for one? It didn't allow us to think about history, how cultural practices shift over time. Didn't allow us to think about movement, right? What happens, say, when people are moving in and out of worlds, and what happens to culture? So I prefer to think of cultural anthropologists as being invested in in understanding the making of social worlds and how those social worlds come to be formed in relation to larger social, political, material, and historical structures, but also being attentive to how those social worlds are made through really kind of ordinary daily rhythms and affects. And that making is important because I think cultural anthropologists realize that the social worlds that they're studying are unfinished, they're ongoing, they're also bound by space and time. Some of those strands might make it into a future, some of them might not. And I was thinking of that a lot because my book is a study of a place in a particular time. So I'm very careful not to suggest that this is all Uttarakhandi culture or Kumaoni culture. That I see that as something, a social world that is always in flux.
Right.
And I think that's what anthropologists do. Anthropologists also rely on ethnography. Um, which is often something that we think of as a method. So that kind of immersive field work where people spend long periods of time in the social worlds that they're studying. So I, for instance, when I was writing my thesis, spent about 18 months in Kumaon, and I've gone back for longer periods since. Some of that commitment to time is being challenged in this moment because of multiple reasons. One, funding structures in the academy, so it's not possible for everyone to go that long. But also, you don't need to go somewhere, right? You can do anthropology around you. You can do anthropology through social media. For instance, you could be seeing what people are posting to Twitter or to TikTok, and understanding how those social worlds are being formed without actually having to move. So I think there are different ways to do it. But it's also a commitment to a kind of writing. And I wanted to actually address that because one of the questions that was posed to me was the relationship between storytelling and ethnography. And I think ethnography, which is the writing of a people, that's the actual translation, is a kind of writing that asks how we can do social analysis through an emphasis on narrative. So how do we understand people's stories as constituting a kind of theory about their own world? And what would it mean to be attentive to those stories and to understand them as histories, to understand them as ways of apprehending social worlds, but also of making social worlds? And so for me, that kind of storytelling is really crucial to anthropology because it also destabilizes the idea that I am the authority on this world, that I am producing a kind of theory as a distant observer. And it's much more about people's stories.
Right. So how did you come to be based in Uttarakhand for this study?
My prior training was in history, and I was interested in understanding the origins of wildlife conservation in India. So when I was doing my master's archival research and research for my MPhil, I was working on the colonial United Provinces, of which Uttarakhand was part at that point, the contemporary state of Uttarakhand. And I was looking at the writings of people like Jim Corbett, James Champion, E.B. Stebbing, all of these colonial foresters who became the leading lights of the early conservation movement in the late 19th centuries and early 20th centuries. And when I was making a shift to anthropology, it made sense to stay in that same region because so many of the questions that had come up in my historical work still resonated in the future. What is the point of conservation? How do you actually think about what it means for people and animals to live together? How do those colonial legacies actually play out in the present? And so Uttarakhand seemed like a really good place to situate a study of that kind, also because it was this kind of biodiversity hotspot, right? Everybody keeps talking about the forest cover, the Himalayan region, leopards in that region, tigers. So it seemed like an interesting place to situate those questions about what it meant for people to live in relation to animals in the context of those broader histories that you were talking about, colonialism, nationalism, gender politics.
We can talk all day about each of the chapters in your book. They're all just such fascinating aspects like animal sacrifice and rams, nationalism and cows. So animal sacrifice seems cruel to urban sensibilities, but to Paharis, it is tied to their identity. How does this conflict with mainstream Hinduism and animal welfare play out in this landscape?
Yeah, I actually started my fieldwork at a really interesting moment. I was there in 2010, which was when some of the kinds of campaigns against animal sacrifice were kicking off. And I found myself immediately struck by the very different ways in which sacrifice was understood by the different kinds of social actors in that scene. So, on the one hand, you had some people arguing, well, this is not Hinduism, this is superstition. So it doesn't count for religious freedom. Others were saying this is just barbarism. It's senseless cruelty. There's no kind of affection or care involved for the animals. But then the people that I was going to temples with, that I would talk to when they were sacrificing animals, were actually in quite a dilemma about the practice and the morality and the ethics of the practice. As a counter to the idea that this wasn't part of Hinduism, they would talk about how important sacrifice was to local deities. So one of the things I write about in the book is how in 2013, when there was this massive kind of cloudburst in the state and several thousands of people were displaced, many people died, there was a sense that the gods were angry and that they were taking revenge. And one person I met immediately took a goat to a temple and sacrificed the goat and said, we're atoning for having ignored our local deities. So for them, it was actually very meaningful, right, in a religious sense, that there was a sense that you had obligations to local deities, and reneging on those obligations would throw this world out of balance. But on the question of cruelty, which I think was a question that really interested me more, there were people thinking about what it meant to be culpable in this way, what it meant to be culpable in the death of another, and how they might understand those actions, how they might atone for those actions. And I write about how, to understand the ethics of sacrifice, we have to locate it in this kind of broader political economy where many of the people were raising the animals that they were taking to temples to sacrifice. It was especially a lot of the villagers. There were, of course, some migrants who would come in and buy goats, but even there were certain kinds of attachments that they cultivated to the animals. But I write a lot about the gendered practices of care that were central to raising these animals. A lot of the work of caring for animals falls on women here. And it's really kind of brutal, back-breaking, literally labor, where you have to bring fodder for the animals every day. You have to take them out to graze. And it's work that actually forges a really kind of close and intimate bond between these women and the animals that they were raising. And I was struck by how much women were invoking those bonds, both to sort of speak about their own grief and their own uncertainty about the practice, what it meant to mourn an animal that they had raised. It was often a really kind of mixed occasion, right? Sacrifice is supposed to be a kind of festival occasion. It's supposed to be, there's a feast around it. And a lot of the times, the women that I would go to these temples with were really, really sad. And and the sadness lingered into the future. So I try to think about how we might understand the possibility that you can find ethics in certain kinds of violence, right? That just violence does not foreclose the possibility that people might have ethical relationships to animals. So there were lots of things I think that moved me. There was one young woman who one day she came up to me, she was someone I knew very well, and she said, "Will you come with me to the temple of this local livestock deity, Eddie?" And usually people would go there only if the cow in their household had a calf, right? On the 11th day, you went and offered some milk from the cow. And then this was supposed to be a significant ritual after which you could start consuming the milk. But their cow had not had a child. So I was wondering why she wanted to go. And so we went up there and she, lit a little diya, she put a few flowers down, did this kind of very small, intimate ritual. And when I asked her why she had done it, she said that she dreamt of this goat that her family had sacrificed long ago. And she felt that the dream was some kind of call, right? Some call for connection, and that she wanted to memorialize this goat. And we spent the whole day talking about small things. He used to love to eat rhododendron flowers, she told me. So when in February, when the rhododendrons are all over the ground, she would take the goats out to graze a little earlier so that he could eat his fill of rhododendron flowers. So I'd look at those moments and say, do we just dismiss this as meaningless, which I think many activists would. They would say, well, this is hypocrisy, right? It doesn't actually make a difference to the life of a goat. Or do we think about the possibility that these kinds of making and unmaking might be crucial to thinking about what it means to live ethically with other beings?
It almost seems to me like, in addition to sacrificing the life of an animal, they're also sacrificing their mental sense, stability, in a way, making it, causing an imbalance of a sort. And that's also an offering. Am I right?
I think what they're offering up in some sense is what it takes to be in balance with a range of entities. And there are always there are certain trade-offs, if you will, right? You're making the gods happy, but you're also participating in a certain kind of violence. So I think it's a really emotionally dense moment.
Yeah.
There's a kind of sense of happiness that you've achieved something. Very often a sacrifice is offered if someone has had a child, for instance, or if they found a job, or if something good has happened. There are also sacrifices for bad things, but we don't have to get into that now. But I think that's a kind of very emotionally fraught moment. So with the happiness, there's also the grief, there's also the guilt, there's also the sense of, well, should we even do this? And I think what I wanted to portray was that those people are having those conversations, right? There's a sense often that, those barbaric people, and this is a language that activists use quite often, right? That they are thoughtless. They're just there to engage in these superstitious acts. And what I wanted to say really was, these people are thinking really deeply about
Yeah.
those questions.
Now, cows are the center of religious politics in India in recent years. But the Pahadis have a more complex relationship and richer understanding, right? You talk about Muni, who refused to leave her crumbling house because she didn't want her cows to think she had forsaken them. Could you
Yeah.
tell us more about her, please?
Yeah, Munni was one of the first. Her story opens the book, and this was in 2010 September. There had been this again massive, just sort of landslides in the region after days of heavy rain, and one of the NGOs in the region had asked me to accompany their field workers to houses that had been affected. And so we went here and we were trying to convince Munni to move because she was insisting on staying in her very heavily damaged house. You know, the whole back of the house had collapsed in a mudslide and she was in the front few rooms. And the NGO worker I went with kept saying, "What are you thinking? You know, a leopard could come in at night, the house could be devastated." And she said, "I'm refusing to leave. I went away for a night and my cow became ill. And, you know, we can't abandon each other essentially." Right. And she used that very kind of like strong language of family and said, "They're my family. I owe them this. What would it mean for me to run off? And I can't take them with me because the people she was living with for that night didn't have space in their cowshed." And so I think about that. And I remember the NGO worker said, "You know, this is a totally mad love. What is wrong with this woman?" And I kept thinking about the idea of a kind of mad love and thinking about what kinds of attachments were entailed in that. And, you know, this is something I talk about in the context of cow protection more broadly, because cow protection's had a really difficult impact on the rural economy. In addition to the kind of horrendous violence that we've seen, you know, within rural economies, there's been just a complete kind of interruption of what it means to have dairy cows. So people are abandoning cows when they're too old. Nobody's picking them up anymore because obviously anybody who's picking them up is terrified of being lynched by mobs, which has happened in that area. So you know, you see all these cows hanging out on the highway, bulls hanging out on the highway. And again, among a lot of activists, there's a sense that, look at these people, they're done with these animals once they're done giving milk. How selfish, how brutal. And I want to show again that, you know, these decisions are not easy for people. And many of the women who were making those decisions to sort of sell off old cows or bulls really struggled with that ethically. And one of the things that has really struck me is that participation in violence is not something that is easily done, right, for people, that they are always trying to think through how they might atone for those gestures. And that's something that I carry into this book, carry through the book rather.
Okay, even wild species such as rhesus macaques open up all kinds of dichotomies: wild and domestic, urban, rural, hills and plains, native, outsider, of what it means to belong and be alienated, rootedness and displacement. I can't think of any other animal that symbolizes these binaries. So, what does this tell you about people's relationships with wild animals? These are not cows or goats that they have this very deep and familial relationships with.
Absolutely. And I actually think that in this case, I couldn't even tell it for any other wild animal. You know, I think that the thing that really struck me, not when I was writing the book, but perhaps later, was that each of the stories that center on a particular species could only be told in relation to that species. You know, I couldn't tell the monkey story for wild boar, for instance. There was a particular way in which they really galvanized those debates. And I think as I say in the book, a lot of that was actually about monkey materiality. You know, people just kept saying, "This is definitely an outsider monkey. Look at them. They love to eat Maggie. Our langurs didn't eat Maggie." You know, and people would point to the fact that these monkeys actually knew how to open chips packets. And one of my favorite moments that I write about in the book was standing at the shop, and this monkey came down, plucked off like a Lay's, I think it was spicy tomato tango flavor, and then opened the bag, took out a chip, and, you know, licked the ridges and closed her eyes in pleasure. And people immediately said, "Look at that. That's a kaddu monkey from the city. You know, that's what the tourists do. And this is what these monkeys do." So I think there was something about their specific kind of materiality, their behavior, their own personalities that made those binaries really kind of stark for people there.
Yeah. So urban people, when when there is any kind of deviant animal behavior, they always blame it on lack of forest or lack of food. But like you say, there is a certain acceptance of animal behavior among the Paharis. Like one person said, I'm paraphrasing here, that a monkey would not be a monkey if it didn't thieve, for instance. It's in their nature. So you talked about these outsider monkeys, which they believe were caught from somewhere else and released in the mountains. But what about their relationship with monkeys that they think belong to them, to their specific area?
There were lots of, so people would talk about the Akela Bandar. This was a whole, the kind of lone male, which when I read some primatology, realized is, usually there are these bachelor bands or lone males who set off. And it was really interesting because people had that sense of what a kind of equilibrium looked like. Right. And they would say, well, our monkeys are shyer. If you go into the forest, you'll see them. And you would go see these monkeys that would run away. And, the urban monkeys look different. They have a different kind of look to them, but they also have very different personalities. They'll come rushing towards you. So when they were talk, they would always talk in these kinds of comparative ways, because by the time I got there, the outsider monkeys were, all over the place. So it was very hard for people to talk about their own monkeys without referring to these guys. And there were all these kinds of interesting comparisons that they were making between themselves and the insider monkeys or their own kinds of native monkeys, saying, we're both kind of shy and retiring, and we're both being put upon by these very loud and kind of vulgar city folk, if you will, both the monkeys and the tourists and the people who were moving into the mountains. So I think there was a sense that this was predicated on behavior, right? A lot of people would say to me, you don't need to go follow this up, just look at the monkeys and tell us that you don't see it. Right. So it was for them very rooted in the bodies of the monkeys themselves. And I think what was striking to me, just to come back to something you said at the start, the problem wasn't necessarily a fragmentation of jungle. Like at least the area that I lived in had some very very nice patches of jungle. The IVRI has this massive forest there that I write about. And the monkeys would come out and they would want to live around people. And we're seeing that increasingly. I mean, as you note in your own work, with so many different kinds of animals, right, that are choosing to live in and around humans. And that's what they were commenting on as well, and saying, this is not us intruding into their habitat. In fact, what you have there is massive agrarian abandonment. So you have actually a lot of fields turning back into kind of secondary habitats for animals. So that's been a kind of interesting thing to note also.
Okay, would you do a reading from your book, from the pig chapter? First of all, show us the book, please.
This is the American edition.
All right.
And I will read perhaps a small section about the ways in which pigs are always thought to be on the cusp of wildness and domesticity. Does that sound good? Mm-hmm. So this is a conversation that I had with a couple. I'd run to their house actually because I came across a group of wild boar, and I was very happily watching them initially until one of them looked up at me, and then I remembered all the horror stories of people who'd had their spines opened when wild boar sort of like came at them. So I turned tail and promptly ran to the nearest house. And then I was telling this neighbor, and so I'm starting with the conversation that we had. The problem, Leela, a sympathetic neighbor said, as I recounted the story of my escape over tea in her kitchen, is that these pigs are just like domestic pigs. They keep hanging around here. Tendrils of smoke curled around her face as she bent to blow vigorously on the fire smoldering reluctantly in the mud stove, the logs of oak and pine having been drenched by the day's rain. If they're wild, then they should live in the forest. They should eat wild plants. But they want the best food: wheat, potatoes, peas. If an outsider saw this, he would say that we are raising them. I'd encountered these pigs in the middle of the village, which is what brought on this conversation. Her husband, Mohan, who was sitting in the front room of the house and watching television while listening distractedly to our conversation, perked up at this. Yes, that's absolutely right, he said. The blue balls behind him were radiant with the reflection of the television, moving shadows mirroring each flicker on the screen. The forest department has dumped the responsibility for these pigs on us. Now, what should we call them? Domestic pigs, wild pigs? Who knows? He spat out sarcastically before turning his attention back to the devotional program that he was watching. After a moment, though, he had an epiphany and walked into the kitchen. Think of them, he said, adjusting his weight in a small wooden chowki, as paltu jungli, domestic wild. There's something wild in them, that much even we admit. But all pigs have that compulsion in them, that much I can tell you. Have you ever heard of the sow who ran away from the IVRI? When I said I had, he smiled. Yay, he said, bringing his hand down in the air delightedly, knowing that I had understood his point without the need for more explanation. Look at that. She wanted wildness, jungli pana, and she ran away. All of them have that compulsion. But even if they are wild, they can't stay without us. They must have a relationship with us. Look at those wild pigs outside. That's why I'm saying they are paltu jungli. Mohan's wonderful phrase, paltu jungli, or the domestic wild, captures the fluid and contingent relationship between the wild and the domestic perfectly. In effect, he was arguing that all pigs are always and already subject to this affective tension between the wild and the domestic. Pigs who are wild consciously seek out humans, but even pigs who are in domestic relationships with humans long to escape the confines of that relationship and go wild. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to chat a little more about the story of the pig. But that moment really struck me as pointing to how insufficient these categories are, wild and domestic, because so many animals travel between them in ways that really confound our understanding of what is the right place for each.
It's sort of interesting to juxtapose the monkeys, their feelings for monkeys with their feelings for pigs, because there is this outsider element. So they trace the antecedents of these pigs to that one that escaped from IVRI.
Yeah.
So, but their relationship is much more accepting of these outside pigs than the outside monkeys. Why is that?
Because I think the pig is not quite an outsider. The pig is a domestic pig. So their problem was they kept saying, why is the state protecting this pig? Right? Like descendants of a domestic pig. It's so crazy to them that, you couldn't go shoot what they thought were clearly animals descended from a domestic pig. So it wasn't necessarily an outsider. There, the outrage was much more, this is a domestic animal, right? That these animals kind of go wild and domestic all the time. And here we have a state telling us, don't shoot them because they're wild. And in the case of the monkeys, on the other hand, there was a whole kind of complex that they were caught up in. People would talk about the trucks arriving at night. There was a whole kind of genre that fit into it, right? The trucks arrived, came from Delhi, they came from Almora sometimes, they came from parts of UP, Mathura, Varanasi. So there was really a kind of outsiderness there, that they were not Pahari monkeys. The pig who went wild was a Pahari pig, but she was a domestic Pahari pig. So I think those categories of domestic, insider, outsider mattered in ways. They did have a difficult relationship even with wild boar, but I think they were also more afraid of the wild boar.
So tell me about the bear stories. What was your reaction when you first began hearing these stories of women's sexual desire and bears?
Yeah, I have to say, I really struggled with how to write that in a way that didn't feel, exoticizing, right? Because I think you say, oh, there are these stories, women believe that bears have sex with women, and people are like, wow, that's really interesting folklore. And I really struggled with how to write it in a way that captured how these women were telling me these stories as fact, right? Not as folklore. And that's something I write about in the book, where they said, ye, lok kahani nahi hai. This is not like a folk tale. This is actual fact. Like when tumhe sachi baat bata rahi hu, I'm telling you the truth. And so I talk about it as baat, right, as a kind of genre of talk. And it struck me on the thing I do in the book is try to think about it in two ways. One, I think about the ways in which women would wield stories of the bear to sort of push back against patriarchal notions of what women's sexuality should look like, right? That it should be tethered to marriage, it should be tethered to reproduction, and that any sexuality outside the bounds of a certain kind of patriarchy is unacceptable. And I think women were using the stories in ways that really played with that. So I talk about this one woman who, told us about how her husband was too tired to have sex with her. And then she told him, well, I wish I was married to a bear. And that was this kind of playful, interesting moment. But I also think about what it does when you break down the species boundary in that way, right? What happens when women were actually wondering what sex with a bear would feel like. And those were these moments where I would listen to these conversations and I was like, wow, there is so much imagination in these conversations, so much imagination of pleasure, so much humor, so much kind of anticipation. And I wanted to convey that too, that in a way, what this does is it also pushes us to kind of break down the species boundary. And so I've been thinking about how, human, animal, gender categories, all of these sort of shift through the telling of these stories about the bear. And that's what I try to focus on in that chapter.
Would you read us a section, please?
Yes, sure. Trying to think of what section to read. Perhaps I'll read one of the talk, just to do that. So I first heard about this when I was at a knitting group, and one of the women said to me, be careful, the bears really like girls from Delhi. And I couldn't understand what that meant. And I talked to this older woman who was kind of reluctant to explain it to me at first. And then she started telling me, and she said, bears abduct women and they do to women what their husbands do to them. And so she said, you have to be very careful. Don't ever be walking alone after evening. And then I was kind of incredulous, I think, or just I was wondering what genre the story was in. And she said, well, ask somebody. So I asked my friend who was a younger woman. She was always very kind of frank on sexual matters. So I thought it would be okay to ask her. So I'll read our conversation. A week or so later, I was sitting across from one of my closest friends, Geeta, helping her to prepare dinner. She had found some amaranth leaves near the cowshed that afternoon, and she was washing them carefully in a faded plastic bucket with jagged edges. I had been tasked with cleaning black soybeans that she dumped from a jar onto a plate. Geeta, I decided, was a good person to ask. She was frank about matters related to sex and spared no one her acerbic tongue, not even her husband of little more than a year. Listen, Geeta, I heard something about bears. I began clumsily. Yes, she said. Her tone was distant. About what they do to women. She looked up at me now, smiling broadly. Heard or found out for yourself? Don't be ridiculous, I said. Rupadi told me. Did she meet a Bhalu? Our laughter was loud enough that we both looked over our shoulder to make sure that her stern father-in-law had not heard us. Is it true? I asked. About bears? Yeah, it's true. What do they do? She stopped chopping the greens and put the knife, now stained a dark vegetal color, down. I too put the plate of soybeans on the ground in front of me. Geeta was a gifted raconteur, and I wanted to write down what she said. So this is a long quote from what she told me. It so happened that one of my neighbors was married into a village near Kanda in Bageshwar. Once, when she came back home, I was very young then, she told me about what had happened to a woman who lived in a village near hers. One night, this woman was washing the dinner dishes outside the kitchen, near the back of the house. Suddenly, a bhalu, a bear, came and took her away. He kept her in his cave, and he rolled a big stone over the entrance when he went out so that she couldn't run away. And then he had sexual relations with her, lying down, litake. And then, when he felt loving, he would lick the soles of her feet. Men go to sleep when they're finished, but this bear would keep loving her. And he would feed her the same things that he ate, hisalu, bhamora, makka. It went on like this for months. But then one day, there was a man whose cows had strayed further into the forest than they usually did. He found her when the bear had gone to hunt. They say that she looked like a bear herself, matted hair and dirt all over her body. They took her to a hospital in Almora. And you know what? She was pregnant. 2 months later, she gave birth to 3 babies, just like little bears. But you know the most interesting thing? My neighbor told me that the woman was sad when they took her away from the bear. She had begun to love him. So I'll stop there. But what struck me, was that these stories about like animals taking humans, right? The wolf child, right? And those kinds of stories from colonial India are so common. And the very similar stories actually emerge from all kinds of places. So once I started doing searches, and you can only imagine what my Google search results must have looked like when I started searching for this, I found instances from medieval Germany. There were similar stories from Japan, from Nepal. But everybody insisted that these were not stories, right? They were truth. So that's how I write about it. And I think, even here you can see the kind of pleasure and the humor that goes alongside it. And so that's what I think through.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the whole cosmology, I don't think that's the word. The way they see the world is there are the deities and then animals and humans. And if animals and humans didn't do their duties, then there's this chaos, and then the deity somehow acts through the animals. So,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of violence sometimes when that imbalance happens.
Yeah.
So, how in there's a lot of talk of man-eating leopards in the hills, and you talk about the hunter who goes after them. And
Hmm.
not only do we do violence to the animals, but the animals also do violence unto us.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about how people see this triangle play out with leopards in
Hmm.
in the hills.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think leopards are really interesting because they're also associated with all kinds of deities. So, there were all kinds of stories I would hear about leopards fasting in temples and so on. So there was a sense that, leopards were outside of human control, but they also had this kind of relation to deities, right? And as you said, could be sort of pulled in by deities if needed. So I write in another article, which I think you're referring to, this small short piece. There was a man-eating leopard in 2012, and I'd gone off to Almora district actually with somebody who lived in a village where this leopard had close to that area where that leopard was operating, and people really didn't know what to make of it. There was this kind of absolute terror. Several people had died. This man-eater hunter was called in and shot one leopard, but the deaths continued. So it wasn't clear if they had shot the wrong leopard or if there was more than one leopard. So there was this real kind of like fear that people were living in. Everyone would rush inside at 6 p.m. You wouldn't want to go to the bathroom because most bathrooms were outside, and that was really considered risky. And people were trying to understand what was happening. And I went to this one very interesting nightly ritual. It's called a jagar, and it's where you're able to communicate with the deities who possess their mediums, right? They appear in the bodies of their mediums. And one of the deities said, look, this is happening because there has been an infraction, right, of land. This land has been sold that a temple was on, and so these relationships have been kind of thrown out of whack. And it wasn't as if people said, oh, that's the only explanation, but it was one of a series of explanations. So I don't want it to seem as if this cosmology was total, where people said, oh, a man-eating leopard has to be a god being angry. But they were trying to explore different ways of what it meant to live with that terror in their lives. And it is really terrifying. I remember being there several times, especially in the winter, and you could hear leopards in the village and you didn't know where they were. And when darkness descends, I was terrified. I would just run promptly indoors. Dogs would disappear all the time. Um, and so there were, I think, for people there really was a sense that they too were prey.
Yeah.
There's, when you read so much of kind of mainstream conservationist literature, it's always this idea that animals are pushed, right, because their habitat has been fragmented or humans have sort of encroached in some ways, which leaves them with no choice but to attack humans. But I think that here there was very much a sense that you were kind of living in this space where power kept shifting between different entities. It's not that people thought of themselves as fully innocent, right? They talked about others who would lay traps, or that they would, they saw these videos circulating that often make the news of a group of people killing animals. So it wasn't that they thought of themselves as powerless, but they recognized that it wasn't them who held power. And that's where I think the category human is so impoverished, right? Because it actually flattens together all kinds of humans. And when you and I talked earlier, we were talking about who has to bear the burden of living alongside animals. And I think those, thinking about class, caste, location, gender, all of those, and how that makes people differentially vulnerable is something that we really need to do instead of operating with human wildlife.
How about reading an excerpt from the Leopard Epilogue?
All right, I'll read the section about the dog, maybe, because the dog and the leopards are tied together. Um, it had been 2 days since Rocky, my neighbor's dog, was taken by a bag, a leopard, in the middle of the night. He was the second dog in the village to have suffered that fate since the start of the month. I knew Rocky well. He lived in the house that nestled comfortably in the curve of the main drag in Pokhri, about 300 meters from where I lived. The first few times I met Rocky, he had growled persistently while driving me away from his house. Despite the assurances of his owner, Bhaguli Babi, that Rocky wouldn't bite, I would stiffen every time I saw him charging towards me. It was only when he saw me with Lobo, the dog who belonged to the family that I lived with, that Rocky warmed up to me, finally allowing me to pat his head and scratch his neck. He and Lobo would play for hours in the field that lay between their houses, darting and fenting with such delight that even those who didn't particularly care for dogs were forced to crack a smile when watching them together. When the one female in the neighborhood came into heat, they would disappear for days on end before finally returning home together. The day I found out that Rocky had been eaten, Lobo and I passed his house in the morning while I was on my way to the next village to meet with a friend. Usually, this was where Lobo and I would part ways. But 10 minutes later, much to my annoyance, Lobo had caught up with me, which meant that I would have to spend the rest of the day fending off dogs who would not tolerate his presence in their territory. In the evening, when I passed Rocky's house with Lobo still firmly attached to me, I ran into Bhabuli, who warned me to get home quickly before a leopard attacked Lobo and me. She told me then that Rocky had been taken 2 nights ago. I was upset when I heard the news and I asked her if she was sad about Rocky's loss. Yes, I am very sad, she said. He was a good dog. He never bit anybody, even though people literally passed in front of our house all day long. I am very sad. But your dada, your literally older brother, is even sadder. He is very fond of cats and dogs. He was the one who brought Rocky home when he was just a puppy. So I go on to talk about how Lobo himself was eaten by a leopard a while ago when I'd returned to the US, and I found out through WhatsApp, and it was a really kind of, just a hard moment because Lobo was this dog that I was very attached to as well. But as I hurried home with Lobo leading the way that evening, I reflected on what it meant for two lives to be related in such a way that the life of one will end in the clutches of the other, that the death of one represents continued life for the other, which is what people said, right? This is what has to happen to dogs. Leopards need something to eat too. A dog's death means life for the leopards. Every time I feel sad, this is something Bhabuli Babi had said to me, I think this is their relationship and who am I to break it? And so I think about that statement, this is their relationship and who am I to break it? And I say at the end of this section, this was not a senseless violence, nor was it born of a simple animal instinct. This was the violence at the heart of relatedness, the expected outcome of a difficult yet inevitable entangling of lives and fates. The loss of one life, as Bhabuli Bhabi reminded me, is essential to the renewal of another and connects them materially, spiritually, and affectively. As the Australian feminist philosopher Val Plumwood reminds us in a posthumously published essay, we need to rethink our concepts of death. We are all food, and through death we nourish others. This is a quote from her. Perhaps it is this recursive play between life and death, regeneration and degeneration, that ties lives together in knots of relatedness. Stop there.
Yeah, this is so personal for me because I lost a dog to a leopard right here.
I'm so sorry.
It's 15 years ago. But, it really brought this whole thing home for me about what it means to live with wild animals. And I was just so ready to get rid of the leopard, call the forest department, catch it, and take it away. And I had to learn from villagers how to be magnanimous, I guess is the word. And so we now take care of our dogs, but the villagers are out with their goats, and I don't know how many goats they lose. And like you said, they go to an incredible amount of effort rearing these animals, and they must be bonding with them, and then to lose them to a wild animal or in any form must be so heartbreaking. So
yeah, it's really hard.
yeah, it's something else. So now for the commercial break, please buy Radhika's charming book, Animal Intimacies. It's available as hard copy and on Kindle. And after you read her book, please be sure to pass on the love. Rate her book on Amazon or Goodreads so others can also pick it up. Thanks so much, Radhika, for this fascinating chat. Lovely
Thank you so
speaking
much,
to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to chat with you, and thank you for listening to me ramble. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I think